Hey guys, in this video we'll talk about the best elite melee units you can actually fit inside a small transport like an Impulsor or Rhino. Transports in 40k give you incredible mobility and protection, but few good melee units can actually embark onto the normal sized transports. So without further ado, let's dive right in. And in the good tradition of the channel, apart from just discussing the top 5, I'm also going to mention how to deal with these units if you actually find yourself on the opposite side of the table from them. And before, when I said normal sized transports, I of course meant not a Land Raider or like a Storm Raven gunship, because those can pretty much fit anything you want in smaller or bigger quantities, and that's not what we're talking about. We want something that can easily hide behind a small ruin and has a very small footprint, which is essentially Rhino and Impulsor. No one uses Razorbacks, but yeah, they would also qualify. Number 5 in our list is a Company Heroes unit. It's essentially a 4-man squad you can attach to any captain, and you must attach it to a captain, otherwise you cannot use it in your game, and it costs 95 points for the whole unit. This can be led by pretty much any captain, and off the top of my head I can only remember Ragnar Blackmane, who cannot lead them, otherwise almost everyone can. That is of course not in Terminator or Gravis armor, we are talking about Tacticus armor only. Why are they in this list? Each model has 4 wounds, and the squad as a whole also gets -1 to wound from all attacks when they are led by a character, which they will be. As you can imagine, 16 wounds and also -1 to wound is not the easiest stat line to go through. It's just annoying. It reminds me in terms of durability a similar situation to the Triumph of St. Catherine, which has a lot of wounds. It's just toughness 3 and essentially like a 3+ save, but it's not that easy to kill. Ask anyone who played against Sisters. This one is not as durable, but it costs less. Also get OC2 on all the models, so in addition to being just a good ablative wound unit for your captain, you also get a lot of OC, so your captain will essentially be able to control a lot of objectives, because OC10 for a 5-man unit is very healthy. It's essentially the same as if your captain was leading like an intercessor squad, which is I guess what GW wants us to do, but we are very unruly and always want something elite and special. The unit has 1 champion, which is the guy with the sword, and it's a good sword. It's 6 attacks at strength 5, AP2 damage 2 with precision, and he hits on 2s as well. That's essentially the help that your captain gets in terms of melee from the unit, because all the other guys are essentially combat weapon only, and that's 401, which does not kill much, but they have 5 attacks each, so in theory, if you have used like Honor the Chapter on the unit and they all get Lance and they all get the AP1, you will be reasonably dangerous against Toughness 3 armies where they only have 1 wound and AP1 is enough to push them to some kind of lower state. But we're not thinking about this unit in this case as something that needs to do a lot of damage on its own. They are a vehicle of delivery and keeping alive of your powerful captain. So for 95 points, you're essentially buying yourself 16 wounds at -1 to wound, and extra melee attacks and extra small shooting damage. Talking about shooting damage, you get a cool heavy bolter, which is damage 3 heavy bolter, and also a devastating wound special bolt rifle like the ones you get on Sternguard. This combo can work for a bunch of good melee characters like Adrax, for example, Agaton, who would give them full rerolls to wound, and you would also get to just deliver Adrax to your enemy, and they can obviously fit extremely well inside an Impulsor, because even though they are 4 wounds each, so very chunky, chunkier than a Terminator in that sense, they still count as normal Tacticus, so they only take 1 spot in any given vehicle. Kanos is a good option of a captain you might want to include with them, and normal captain as well, to deliver that finest hour once per game ability. How I think about these guys is essentially you can have for the same role of just sending your captain into the fray and hoping that they will trade upwards in terms of the price, and that can actually work pretty well, especially considering that you can leave your Impulsor behind the wall and have him, I don't know, doing actions for you the rest of the game, and you are essentially sending just the captain plus the squad, and the squad can do either of 2 things. If it's Assault Intercessors, you are getting extra melee output out of the unit, but Assault Intercessors don't qualify as elite melee, so I'm not including them here. Another option is to allow your character have a chance to survive longer. So going through 16 wounds of -1 to wound is not easy, especially if you spend 1 CP on Armor of Contempt on them, and that will make your opponent actually invest resources to get to that captain, otherwise they're risking him just running around and killing things. Yes, he's not going to be as deadly after he uses is the finest tower, but still not something you want to have in your back lines. So that's just the paradigm difference. Either you want extra durability for your captain, or you want to absolutely guarantee a maximum damage from that one shot you get on sending him against something in your opponent's army from your transport. In terms of dealing with this unit, they obviously don't have invulnerable save, so high AP stuff works great against them, and damage 2 would do well considering they have 4 wounds each. It's not gonna be that easy because of -1 to wound, but it is the best way to go through them. As always, I want to remind you about my Patreon 40k coaching service. If you're looking for help building your competitive rosters, preparing you for tournaments, or have any questions about your collection in general, check out the links for my Patreon in the description. Thank you. Next are Death Company Marines. So these guys are very likely to be shifted out in the new Codex Blood Angels that is coming very soon, somewhere in the summer or maybe early fall. For now, we can use them pretty well, and a 10-man unit costs 250 points, so 25 points per model. They are one of few really lethal melee units you can actually fit inside a Rhino. That sounds funny because Rhino is supposed to be a very universal Space Marine transport, but it actually does not work like that. It transports a lot of great stuff for other Space Marine-esque armies like Death Guard, for example, or Thousand Suns, but not the vanilla Space Marines, because those guys essentially lost all of their basic non-jump pack melee infantry, and things like Bladeguard cannot go inside the Rhino because, well, then you would not need to buy the Impulsor. Wink wink. The actual list of units that can go inside a Rhino in a Space Marine book is very small, and Death Company Marines are one of them. They essentially have the same profile as the famous Death Company Marines with jump packs, which are also probably going to be shifted out in the new book, and we'll have to use the guys that only know how to carry chainswords, because apparently the chainsword is supposed to be the best melee weapon ever. I don't know why they are doing it like that. I actually don't know, because melee struggles already quite severely, especially in armies that are not melee dominant, like World Eaters, which they are good in melee still, but other armies, and we'll discuss that a bit later in the video, they do struggle to actually put a melee unit on the table that can deal damage to tougher monsters and vehicles. These guys, they can do damage, and they are 3 attacks each at strength 8, AP2 damage 2 with the Power Fist, and Power Fist is the best loadout probably you want on them. You could have the Thunder Hammers, but the maths on that is pretty much Power Fists are better in most situations, and Inferno Pistols are something that you also get if you're not taking the Thunder Hammers, because you have a free hand on these guys, and the Inferno Pistol is strength 8, AP4 damage D3 with damage 2 extra for melter range, which is 3 inches. The total range is 6, and that means that these guys can do some horrible stuff to tanks up close. They also still get the Death Company 6+ Film Pain, they also get the full reels to hit, and they also need still a chaplain within 12 of them to remind how Horus looks, otherwise they go crazy and lose their OC and their mind. They also get another of those cool what doesn't kill you makes you stronger Kelly Clarkson's type of rules, which their one is sustain hits 1 when they go below starting strength, and sustain hits 2 when they go below half strength, meaning that if your opponent doesn't actually finish them off, and Film of Pain helps to maybe prevent that to a certain extent, then they would get to hit much harder the next turn, or in the next phase, depending on how you look at it. Perhaps someone charged them, and then you interrupt, and they will hit much harder. You probably want a chaplain with these guys, because a chaplain only costs 65 points, and if you're investing in 250 points unit, you might have that extra 65 points, but it depends entirely on your detachment. If you're running them as Sons of Sanguinius, perhaps you don't really need the extra buffs, because with so many attacks and extra strength on the fists, which is going to be strength 10 by that point, you might not really need an extra +1 to wound, but that is always nice. Or you can have a lieutenant with them for lethal hits, and lethal hits stack really nicely with full rerolls to hit you have with them, and also fall back and charge. Decision on whether you need a chaplain or not will probably come to how many chaplains you have in your list in total, because if you only have something like Lamartis, perhaps he will not be actually within 12 of these guys, and you might not want to have a situation where they cannot fall back. So think about that on the list writing level. For 25 points per model on how small the footprint of a Rhino is, how easy it is to hide behind ruins, you just cannot beat that threat density per square centimeter. In terms of how you can deal with these guys, well, they are still toughness 3 Space Marines without any invulnerable save, so anything that has good AP, and damage 3 is probably what you want there. Damage 2 still works because Fatal Pain 6 plus is not Fatal Pain 5 plus, so you are more likely to fail both than you are to actually pass one of them and keep the model alive. So damage 2 still works against these guys, so any Terminator weapons, well, a million things in 40k now. And also what helps really against them is the fact that they are not jump X, so they only have move 6. If someone's playing Sons of Guineas, they cannot advance and charge, meaning that their threat range is significantly reduced. Yes, they will have extra 3 inches of movement when they're disembarking from a Rhino, that helps, but you still can sort of tape measure your way around them, and if you are careful, you can avoid them until, well, your opponent just has to long bomb charge against you, like a 9-incher or something, and by that point they're out of the transport and potentially fail their charge, and then you can capitalize on that and destroy them. Now, Bladeguard Veterans, our good old G.I. Joe Marines with a sword, and I love these models. I've been waiting for them in 9th edition. I'm so happy they came out. Unfortunately, now I think they are a bit lacking in terms of the flavor, because they are supposed to be super veteran, highly trained Marines with, I don't know, something very impressive, and they're just not clicking with me in terms of how their stat sheet looks. Other 3 wound elite melee units that we will look today at are better at just convincing me that they are so elite and dangerous. But they still have a very good baseline to build from, which is 4+ invulnerable, say they have 4 attacks each, a strength 5, AP 2, and damage 2. You need a lot to make this really shine, but it is doable, and you definitely want lethal hits or +1 to wound with them. That's just the starting point. You do not go out of your house without this kind of buff with them, because strength 5, AP 2, and damage 2 is not gonna go well into anything that is high toughness or even mid toughness, to be honest. Oh, lethal hits are more efficient against toughness 10 and higher than +1 to wound, a bit more efficient. There are numerous ways to get to that. It can be stratagems, it can be characters. I'm not going to go through the entire list. Space Marines have too many ways to get buffs, but you get the point. You certainly need one of these buffs to have some sort of lethality against vehicles and monsters. Probably 2 buffs to be actually reasonably lethal, something like extra AP. So imagine Honor the Chapter +1 to wound and extra AP. Then you're more likely than not to kill a normal toughness 10 3+ save 12 wounds tank on the charge with a 6-man squad. And there I come to the thing I wanted to tell you about, which is something I am worried about in terms of melee units nowadays. If you calculate the efficiency of a 6-man Bladeguard unit, which costs 180 points, and give them Oath of Moments, so full rerolls to wound, which is your army rule to really buff them, but don't give them any other buffs, your chance of killing a Rhino, a simple, humble Rhino, are 50%. Well, I think like 52%, something like that, around 50%, which is very low. Just imagine if you just need to crack open a transport that costs like 70, 75 points, depending on which army we're talking about. It's extremely low, so there is a problem in terms of how these elite melee units are perceived. Nowadays, the game is overwhelmed with a bunch of transports, a bunch of tanks on monster platforms, and these units that used to be pretty good against those because you just used to start at wounding them on 5s, and these guys now wound a tank on 6s. There is a big difference between wounding things on 4s and wounding things on 5s, believe me. Really want that to change sometime in the future, because it doesn't feel right that such an elite melee unit is struggling so much into a simple transport. But I digress. So all in all, of course, they are much better against lighter targets like Terminators, elite infantry, things like that. And the most important thing is they provide great protection to your character. So in that sense, they are more of a bladed wounds plus damage kind of situation compared to some other units that we'll look at later, which are more damage, extra damage in addition to your character. But you get more damage than you would get from something like company heroes, of course, at a higher price. You can run them with something cool like Ragnar Blackmane. So inside an Impulsor, you park it behind a ruin, and then with a 9-inch move essentially outside of transport, then a D6 advance, you'll have a very good threat range for the crazy amount of attacks that Ragnar brings. In terms of killing these guys, they are essentially just worse Terminators in terms of durability, so it's easy to wound them. You don't have -1 to wound, and you would wound them on 2s with almost any anti-tank or even like soft anti-tank weapons like Redemptor's plasma cannon. So a lot of things that are damage 3 are going to be good against these guys, and you just need to hope that invulnerable saves will not spike. That actually is one of the big problems of invulnerable saves when you're playing against them. They sometimes just roll well, they can roll well, and if your opponent rolls well, then you are in a much worse situation than you could have been, but it goes both ways. Next is Inner Circle Companion. So the new kids on the block, they were released with the Dark Angels book. I love the models. They're just absolutely amazing. If you read the Dark Angels novels about the early sort of adventures of the chapter back when they were reunited with Lionel Johnson, I always imagined exactly this kind of look with power armor, and on top of that some sort of tabard and drapery and all these symbols. They are just amazing models. GW did an amazing job sculpting these guys. But enough about the models. So same cost as the Bladeguard Veterans, which is 30 points per model, but they have a different stat line and a different role. Essentially, as I said before, these guys are a damage dealing unit. They are also 3 wounds each. They are also power armor main. They don't have an invulnerable save, which is a big deal for their survivability, because now they are really easy to kill if you don't help them in any way. And you're still paying 30 points per model, so they are kind of expensive. Just for reference, I think the Blightlord Terminators now are about 33 points per model, so we are nearing that Terminator level cost where we don't have 2+ save, 4+ invulnerable save, and toughness 5. But here's why you're paying this. First of all, they are -1 to hit always when led, so both from shooting and melee. They also have OC2 base, unlike the Bladeguard Veterans, which are OC1 only. And the big thing about them is significantly better melee. They hit like a freight train. Now, after the balanced status slate, before they were really anemic. They are strength 6 instead of strength 5, meaning that you will be wounding much more units on 5s. Most important toughness in the game, which is toughness 10, you will be wounding that on 5s base. And that means with +1 to wound, that is force to wound. Really a big jump in efficiency. They also have a sweep and a strike profile, and both are AP2, which is unusual. It's even hard to explain how good having a sweep is against literally any toughness 3 army, and the sweep they have is just amazing. It's 5 attacks each at strength 6 AP2 damage 1 and sustain hits 2. So 5 attacks each, sustain hits 2. That means that from a 6-man unit, you're just gonna have so many chances to roll incredible amount of hits. Strike is still very good as well. It's 4 attacks, strength 6, AP2 damage 2, and lethal hits inbuilt. They hit much harder than the Bladeguard Veterans could ever dream of. You also get +1 to hit against characters, which means both solo characters and of course units that have characters inside them, so a lot of different stuff in 40k. Their sole problem is the lack of good saves, so therefore I think the best character to lead them is Azrael. He gives them 4+ invulnerable save, and he gives them sustain hits 1 for their strike. Yes, of course you don't double dip on the sustain hits with the sweep, but you already have sustain hits to give me a break. I've heard a lot of people complain that, well, if you put the Azrael in a transport, you're not going to benefit from his 1 CP generation. And yeah, you are correct. But for me, I think of it as you are losing 1 CP on that, because depending on whether you embark Azrael in the transport before you move out or you disembark, well, depending on when he disembarks, essentially you usually lose 1 CP in general. You only lose 1 command phase where he would get to generate it. In my opinion, it is stupid, and those abilities should be able to go off inside a transport. That's what communications are for in 40k, but that's besides the point. Losing 1 CP but getting the extra mobility that you would get from a transport and the incredible combo of the Azrael plus these guys, I think is worth it. The same goes for having Azrael plus Hellblasters and Fire Discipline enhancement, or like Azrael plus Hellblasters plus the Inner Circle detachment for +1 to wound. So all of those, I think you really want Azrael to be inside a transport at some point and wasting sort of 1 CP, and that is only in case you don't get the card that you can discard. Remember, you still can get that CP in the turn if you get to discard a card. So I think that is worth it. In case you just want to give them 4+ invulnerable save, there's also an option of just giving Librarian to the unit. Then they would get 4+ invulnerable save, a cool looking Librarian guy with a Force Sword, which is not that great, but he looks cool. And also 4+ Feel Pain against any psychic attacks. So if you're playing against, well, Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, they will hate you for this. They work incredibly well both in Gladius and Inner Circle for different reasons. Of course, Gladius gives them incredible mobility and also great buffs for melee. Inner Circle just gives them amazing buffs for melee, making them a real blender of a unit. As for dealing with them, essentially the same thing applies where they are 3-wound Marines with no invulnerable save. If they don't have an invulnerable save, everything that is damage 3 works perfectly against them. If they have an invulnerable save, same story, you just have to throw essentially double the amount of attacks into them depending on your AP, but they will not have Feel No Pain, and that means damage 3 is the best way to kill them. Also, depending on the detachment your opponent is running, they might have again the problem of reaching your opponent, but if they have advanced charge, then their threat range is going to be quite large. Last but definitely not least are the Sword Brethren, which are number 1. They are absolute badasses of the melee units world, with 3 wounds each, again as our melee elite units tend to be, and also 30 points per model, so 150 points per unit of 5. And by the way, our previous contenders, so Bladeguard and Inner Circle, they capped out at a 6-man unit with a small version of a 3-man unit, which is interesting because it allows you to fill up the Impulsor completely and you have all 7 seats occupied, where Sword Brethren are one of few units like this where they start at 5 and they can go up to 10. Well, they can become this sort of huge brick monstrosity unit that you actually can and sometimes want to run, especially in Righteous Crusaders detachment. But for now we're talking more about the small transport situation, so that's a 5-man unit. These guys are by far the owners of the best ability, and the total unit output of these is just amazing. They also don't have an invulnerable save, and that is a problem, like with the Inner Circle companions, but they used to be 2 wounds each, so I think overall they received a glow up in 10th edition. They fit perfectly in a Land Reader or Impulsor. Again, we're talking about small transports here, but just so you know, Land Reader is a great option for them. Any guy can carry a Power Sword instead of the Chain Sword, where you have an option for a Chain Sword, but you don't want to use it. And Power Swords are 4 attacks each at strength 5, AP 2, damage 1, and you can ask me like, well, it doesn't really look that well, but wait for it. For every 5 models, you get 1 Thunder Hammer, so that is already nice, 1 Plasma Pistol, 2 Pyre Pistols, so some Overwatch potential against really lightweight units, Twin Lightning Claws, so extra attacks and Twin Linked, and the Castone, which is a Sergeant, can have a Power Sword hitting on 2s with 4 attacks, strength 5, AP 2, damage 2. Of course, the best part is their ability, and you get +1 damage on all melee attacks in the unit. All the blades become damage 2, big difference. The Sergeant and the Thunderhammer become damage 3, that is incredible, and the Lightning Claws as well, a bunch of attacks with damage 2 and Twin Linked. But most importantly, the characters leading the unit also get the enhanced damage. So imagine damage 3 Power Fist on your Captain or Lieutenant, damage 2 or damage 4 Sword on Helbrecht, so his sweep becomes damage 2, AP 3, strength 6, strength 7 actually, and damage 4 strike. He provides the +1 strength and critical 5s to the unit, and that goes incredibly well with the Lieutenant, making the so-called mini Hellbrick. The big Hellbrick is what you run in the Righteous Crusaders, that's 10 Sword Brethren, Lieutenant, and Helbrecht with the 10 Houses Bones. 4/5 plus Feel No Pain, but again, we're not talking about that here. If you're fighting against the low wound models, you can also have an option, you can also choose the option of +1 attacks for the unit, so just make them an absolute monstrosity in terms of the volume of attacks. A very universal unit, the only problem being, again, their durability, but they hit so hard, especially with correct characters, that you can just use them to always trade up if you are correctly choosing the targets and applying buffs again correctly. In terms of dealing with them, well, the same story as Inner Circle companions, damage 3 is the king, especially if you're not playing against the Righteous Crusaders option, which will at least have the 6+ or 5+ Feel No Pain depending on the situation. Let me know if I forgot something, I might well have, and thank you for watching, I'll see you next time.